Welcome to the Thriving Children podcast, the show that helps parents and teachers to put the magic back in child development. Here's your host, Clare Crew.
This is episode 66 of the Thriving Children podcast. I'm Clare Crew, and in this episode, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Tom Hobson, otherwise known as Teacher Tom. A big warm welcome to you.
Hi, Claire.
So you're a blogger and an educator, and you share stories about life at Woodland Park Cooperative Preschools. And it seems to be a really unique setting, so I thought we could start by hearing you describe it.
Sure. Well, our school, the model of our school is called a cooperative school. And this is not a brand new model. It's been around for well over 100 years. In fact, I think the original co-ops were in Australia, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But really in the 1940s and 50s, they became sort of what I call a middle-class housewives revolution. And families found themselves kind of isolated in suburbs and started saying, well, but we want our kids to grow up with other kids. And so they started really going from home to home is really how co-ops started. And over time, they've evolved to hire teachers and now have become what we have today. And what a co-op is it's a school that is owned and operated by the parents who enroll their children in the school. So in a very real sense, and I'm the only paid employee. So in a very real sense, we have 85 students in our school. I have 85 bosses, and I am the only employee. They hire me, they fire me, they evaluate me. But by the same token, on a day-to-day basis, part of the way a cooperative works is the parents work in the classroom with me as assistant teachers, in addition to doing all the other things that go into making a school operate. So I'm in charge of classroom things as the teacher, but the parents are responsible for everything from administrative work to janitorial work to maintenance to planning field trips to enrollment to all of the other things that schools typically have to have staff for. So it's one of the ways we keep our tuition incredibly low. And we're able to make it affordable for a lot of families. Now, by the same token, the families need to be able to put time into the classroom at least once a week working with me as my assistant teachers, which is really wonderful because that means when I go into my classroom with 22 two-year-olds, I often have as many as 11 adults in the room helping me out, which is really quite a pleasure.
And I'm guessing as well that this cooperative setup also allows for a lot more flexibility in the style of education that evolves.
It certainly allows us to do, we can have a lot of activities available for the children above and beyond just, the standard fare, because we have adults sort of taking care of all the different parts of the classroom. What I often say is, the way I grew up, and I'm sure many people that are of my age grew up, is we lived in these neighborhoods where when you would get up in the morning, even as young as 4 years old, and your mom would say, "You're driving me crazy, go outside." And you would spend your whole day outside. And you would go from neighbor to neighbor and house to house, visiting all the other children, going up and down the street. And my memories were of very little adult supervision. But I'm sure, and I know for a fact now, that at every kitchen window, there was a mother washing her dishes, keeping an eye on the kids as they came through her yard. And that's sort of how I talk to the parents about how we operate our school. They are those moms in the kitchen window, keeping an eye on the kids, making sure things don't get out of hand, but at the same time, staying out of their way while they were having fun out in the backyard or banging on the piano or playing in the gutters, whatever the kids were having fun doing.
Brilliant. I'm guessing a pretty enjoyable place to work.
It certainly is. I really feel like we don't, every preschool becomes a community of children. And the cooperative model allows it to become a community of families, because I really get to become quite familiar with all the parents because I work with them and I rely on them, supervising them on a day-to-day basis, whereas at the same time, on an annual basis, they're supervising me. So it's a beautiful circle, kind of community circle. And I think it's a really natural way for children to become educated in the context of community. I know that all progressive education is marinated in community, as Alfie Cohen says, and I think we do a really good job of that. I do want to mention that we are not particularly unique in our part of the world. In the Seattle area where we operate, there are well over 200 cooperative schools.
Wow.
Our system alone has 45 schools in it, and we operate under the auspices of one of the community colleges.
Well, certainly for the part of the world that I'm in, I would say that the setup you've got is incredibly unique. I mean, there are a few alternative schools, but nothing that I'm aware of in this state based on that cooperative model. So it's awesome that you can blog about it, and we can, I guess, get the benefits of your wisdom and insight through your experiences.
Well, thank you. And I know that in New Zealand, the play center model is somewhat similar to the cooperative model.
Yeah, still not quite here, but
Right.
yeah, New Zealand do a lot of things quite well in regards to education. So hopefully, eventually, things will start rubbing off for us. I think that we seem to be going more and more down that standardised route where, yeah, the people that are making decisions aren't people that really know anything about children or child development. So yeah, there's a lot of money thrown in areas of education which any educator can tell you won't actually fix anything.
It's unfortunate that though the policymakers seem to trust everyone except teachers when it comes to education.
Yes, absolutely. So in regards to your role as an educator, Tom, how do you see that playing out in a typical day?
Okay, so to me, I think the most important part of my day is that first 2 hours before the children arrive. That's when I'm getting the classroom ready for the children, because once the kids arrive, it's fun. That's the part where we are living as a community and doing the work of community, and everybody enjoys that kind of process. But it's getting it ready and preparing for the children, deciding kind of thinking to myself, all right, what were the children doing yesterday? What direction might they be going? What are some of the materials and concepts that need to be available to them in the environment to support them in where I think they might be going? That said, it's really easy, and we can't help it. We all have our own agendas as we think this through. We think about what we want them to be doing or what we expect them to be doing. And the thing that I've really learned, and that I really feel like we need to do in a play-based environment, is to be prepared at any moment. The second the children show us what their true agenda is, we need to be prepared to set our agendas aside. So very often all that planning goes for naught because we need to follow where the children are taking us. The Reggio Emilia model talks a lot about the three-legged stool of early childhood education. The three teachers, the first teacher being the parent, second teacher being the classroom teacher, and then the third teacher is the environment. And I really think of that time when I'm preparing myself as working with my third teacher and getting her ready and getting myself ready to work with her, with the children. And a part of that too is creating a certain kind of boundaries for the children. Because we know they need some kind of limitations and some kind of boundaries and some structure in order to feel comfortable and safe within an environment. I would say the second thing about the way I look at my job is that really I'm a researcher. I am there to observe, and a big part of my job is simply to stand back and watch what's going and really try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So what I hear there is that, yes, there is some planning. Yes, there is some agenda from yourself as an educator, but the children trump all of that.
Well, they have to. And the moment you see, I so often have materials ready. And then once the children start going in the direction they're going to go, the materials stay on a shelf and never come out because that's the way they're taking it rather than the way I expected them to go. I think another aspect, though, that I really think, I said, observing and being a researcher and staying out of it and kind of trying to really understand what they're doing. I think another piece in some cases, though, that I have increasingly found valuable is to actually figure out how to play with the children. And by that I mean, so often as adults, we come in and we sort of take over the play when we try to play with the children. The big rowdy adult with all the good ideas, and and the kids have fun with it. I'm not saying they don't enjoy it, but it's not them taking the lead. And what I've really tried to practice doing is playing with them as a peer, being one of the kids. And I'll give you an example of that. Several years ago, there was I have to go back a little bit, but the children in our classes always make all of their own rules. And I really have a very strong sense of, I want my classroom to be as democratic as possible. And so we start our school year with absolutely no rules whatsoever, but usually within a matter of a few hours, someone has said, she hit me. And I'm able to say, oh, that must have hurt. Does anybody like to be hit? No, nobody likes to be hit. So let's make that a rule. Let's all agree, no hitting people. And so that's how our rule-making process happens. Anyway, we go down our list, we start making our rules, and every year, and part of this is a function of where I live in America and the political culture here, but every year for my first decade of teaching, the children always banned weapons. They always banned guns, they banned pretend guns, and they banned real guns. And it happened every year. And it doesn't mean they didn't play toy guns, but it did mean that they had all agreed that they didn't think it was a good thing to be doing. This was then about 5 years ago. We added a classroom of older kids. We added some 5-year-olds to our class, and I was going through the rule-making process with these 5-year-olds. And sure enough, one of them suggested that we ban guns in the classroom. And I said, absolutely, all right. I think we all agree, no guns in the classroom. What about pretend guns? Oh, no, Teacher Tom, we can play pretend guns. And I have some energy on this issue. And I said, well, what do you mean? Aren't you going to be scared when people are pointing their guns at you and pretending to shoot you? No, Teacher Tom, we know the difference. And so for the first time ever, I had a classroom where gunplay was a legal part of the classroom, an agreed upon part of the classroom play. And it was crazy. We had 22 or 23, I think we had 24 kids in that class. And some days, all of them were shooting each other. It was the boys and the girls. Usually they were out on the playground playing this game, and it was a metaphorical bloodbath every day. The kids running around and shooting each other, and it was pretty unsavory looking to those of us, adults looking on. And it was particularly embarrassing because a lot of this was happening at the time of year when families were visiting the school to consider enrolling their children for the next year. And what they were watching were these children just, shooting at each other. And one day, and this was a day actually where they had chosen, instead of pretending guns, they had taken some of those swimming pool noodles and they were using them as whips and they were beating on each other. And they had teams, and it just looked so violent and so awful. And one of the parents even said to me, Teacher Tom, this might be one of those times that, that the grown-ups need to make a rule about this because it looked so out of control and violent. But then I remembered playing similar type games when I was a kid, and I said, well, I'm going to go play with them. And they were playing, we have this big abandoned boat, a rowboat in the middle of the play space. And I went and I sat in the boat where they were playing, and I sat down and said, I'm a bad guy. And the kids just stopped, and little Mara looked at me and she said, Teacher Tom, are you really a bad guy? And I said, yeah, I'm a bad guy. And she said, I'm queen of the bad guys. And then another boy outside of the boat said, are you really a bad guy, Teacher Tom? And I said, yeah, I'm a bad guy. And he was a good guy. And so suddenly I was under this, they were wailing on me with these swimming pool noodles, and I'm defending myself. And pretty soon the good guys took off running around the playground space and left all us bad guys in the boat. And Marat said, okay, I'm queen of the bad guys. Teacher Tom, you can be king of the bad guys. And another boy said, well, I'll be the guard of the bad guys. And somebody else said, I want to be the maid of the bad guys. And they were all picking their roles as bad guys. Suddenly the good guys came back and the battle was on again. And they were all hit. I didn't arm myself because that's against my principles, but I was defending myself and they were all hitting each other. And the thing that I noticed from the middle of the play, it looked like such violent play from the outside, but on the inside, they were all talking to each other and negotiating the game as they're playing. Hey, that hurt me. Stop it. No, wait, you're on my team. I don't like it when you do. And they were talking about this and self-regulating this game from inside of what looked like chaos on the outside. And I was able to walk out of there and go back to those adults and say, those kids, they're doing really complex play inside of what looks like craziness. They are really negotiating and working together to try to make this safe and fun for everybody the whole time and thinking about how each other are feeling. And so one at a time, each one of the adults went in and took my role in the game as king of the bad guys. And they each came away with a very similar experience. So I think there's a lot to be learned by getting in the middle of the play. And if we can avoid the instinct to take it over, we can learn a great deal about what they're doing.
Yeah, some incredibly powerful learning for you guys. And, that took more effort than just stopping the play, but actually, that led to more learning for you and for the children.
Well, certainly more for me. And the children were already teaching themselves exactly what they needed to know, and they'd been doing it for months. And I only
Yeah.
just then realized what was going on.
So that probably gets me quite nicely onto the next question. Now, this has been sent through from Brett, who is one of your readers, and he's a male working in early childhood education. And he's keen to know if you feel that being a male educator influences the style of play that revolves around you.
I'm not the right person to ask about that. People say all the time, I get this, comment all the time. I say I teach preschool, and people say, oh, that's so great. We need more men in early childhood. And that's probably true, but I don't know why. I don't understand that. I don't understand that because, some people say, oh, well, men bring a different energy to the classroom, but I don't know what that means. I think what they mean is there tends to be a little bit more perhaps rowdy play, more tolerance of some of that type of play. And maybe that's true in general. That said, I know many female teachers who are much rowdier than I am when they play with the kids. In fact, teacher Rachel, is our kindergarten teacher now, is often much rowdier than me. She gets out there and tussles with the kids, whereas I never do that. But I would say, I don't know if it influences. I suppose it does in the beginning. I think a lot about the fact that for many of the children who come and play in our school, they're the main male, adult male they've played with is their father, or maybe an uncle or somebody else from a family member. And the fun game that they play is very often wrestling and things like that. So they do come to, they seek that out from me to a certain extent. And I find myself, I don't want to spend my days wrestling. So I find myself sort of trying to divert that play into other types of play or turn that energy to one another rather than making me be the intermediary for their play. But I honestly can't answer his question because I don't know. From the inside, I can't tell what's different. People tell me it's different. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess that's hard when you're the one kind of knee deep in it, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And I honestly, when I look around at my female colleagues with more experience and everything else, I would say the one thing that I will honestly say that that happens by being a male in this role is I believe that I benefit from sexism. I believe that there are a lot of people who specifically choose my school because I'm a man, and there aren't that many men there. And there are women who can do the job, do the things I do better than I can, who are overlooked just because of their gender.
Yeah, that's an interesting takeaway. Yeah, I'm not sure whether...
I find myself very often, I'm going on this tour of Australia and I'm going to be speaking to audiences of women, and I'm always very, very self-conscious about that I'm often... during the breaks, there's a line to get into the women's toilet, and I get a whole big toilet to myself.
Well, Brett's going to come along to the Adelaide talk, so you have to share the toilet with him.
I'll share a toilet with him.
Yeah, absolutely. So when conflict comes up between children, how do you handle a situation like that?
So I'll give you an example. In a classic situation, it would be, tussling over a toy. That I had it first type of thing. The first thing I do is obviously the first step, and I tell all the parents who work in our classroom this too, our first step is if somebody's getting hurt, we stop the violence. So if somebody's being hit or if somebody's kicking somebody or something, we physically make that stop by holding an arm or holding a leg. We're capable of doing that. We're bigger than stronger than these kids. At that point, but usually if they're just tugging over a toy back and forth, what I like to do is I'll put my hand on the toy. And I just put my hand on it, just sort of make sure they know that neither one of them is going to get control of this, but they can keep their hands on it. And I keep my hand on the toy, and I say, because I mentioned before we make our own rules, so I'm able to say, well, we all agreed, no taking things. It looks like you both want this toy. Sally, what's happening here? And then Sally will say, I had it first. And then I'll say, Johnny, what's happening here? And he'll say, well, I had it first. And then very often, then I get the kids trying to talk to each other and have them go. And very often we go several rounds of I had it first, I had it first, I had it first. And then they begin to understand they need to start expanding on that. So I try to get the children talking to each other. And by holding the toy, I believe I take that bone of contention out of the middle of it.
I think it has that calming influence as well, I guess, because there's that adult presence and you're not manipulating what transpires next, but you're there supporting them to resolve the issue themselves.
Well, I want them to be talking to one another, because and very often the way sometimes the conversation goes where one of them says, okay, I'll go first, and it goes the way you want it to. Well, I'll do it for a while and then you can play with it. More often than not, it's an outsider. It's one of their friends who comes over and says, I think you should share it. One of the disinterested observers. And I really encourage other children to come in and take part in the conversation, a dialogue, and make suggestions. And I spend a lot of time echoing. So a lot of time a child will say, I put it down on the floor, but I was going to come back and get it. And if there's a long pause and it doesn't see, and I don't know if the other child really understood what was said, I'll echo exactly what was said. She said she left it on the floor and was going to come back and use it. Well, I found it on the floor. And nobody was using it when I found it on the floor. And then then we get them going back and forth and figuring out exactly what it is. A lot of times children, and I would say this is more true of boys than girls very often, will decide that it's just not a hill they want to die on, and they decide, they give up and they go do something else. Because they don't want to spend their time, they don't want to waste their playtime talking with somebody else.
They just want to get on with it.
They want to get on with it, exactly. So that's how usually the way I deal with it is I just get in there and I just kind of put my body right in the middle and encourage them to talk to one another. If somebody's really crying, then I start noticing the emotion. Sally is really sad. She's crying about this. And then I leave a lot of silence. And I think that's the most important thing. I think so often adults, we're afraid to leave that long space of silence and let the children, because I think that's when we leave that space, that gives them some space to do thinking for themselves and to think about the situation and think about solutions. And so I think that's one of the things I think would be the biggest takeaway for me, and the biggest thing that I've learned is to shut up.
Yeah, it's so simple really, but so powerful. And it's definitely not the approach that a lot of educators would take to resolving conflict. So hopefully that will start to get some cogs turning.
Well, I hope so too. I know that one of the benefits I have with my model, and I will say, is that, that if you're one teacher and you have 25 children in your classroom, or 20 kids, I know some U.S. cities have more than 25 kids in a class with one teacher. It's really hard to take the time to do it that way, because you've got 20 other kids who need your attention as well. So I really do think that having more adults in the classroom and having better ratios is one of the keys to being able to do this better.
Very true. And also, I guess, having more of a flexible agenda or timetable, almost lack of timetable really, where you're not thinking, okay, but this is the maths lesson and I really shouldn't be fixing this social problem right now. Like, I think there's a lot of that self-talk that goes on for many educators, where there's a constant state of feeling rushed and feeling that they need to tick everything off in their diary, as opposed to just going with the flow and going with the learning that presents itself.
I think you're absolutely spot on with that. That's one of the things that people are very envious of, is I am not required to do any documentation whatsoever. And so I don't have to do that, and I don't have evaluators coming in and making me tick boxes. So I'm able to do, I think, what's most important for the children at any given moment. And I know I'm doing the right thing then.
Interestingly though, Tom, like you do your blog pretty much every day. And part of me was going, oh my goodness, how does he blog every day? But that's almost like your own documentation. That's your personal reflection of what's happening in the space or how you view certain situations. So no one could ever sort of say, well, hang on, what is he doing all day, every day? Because you have got that documentation. It's just in a different, I guess, more purposeful format for you.
Well, I certainly see my blog as it's a vital part of my reflective practice as a teacher. And so you're absolutely right about that. The other piece though is, and the way I do I do a version of documentation, but because my supervisors are also the parents that have their children in the school, and they're standing right beside me, I'm able to go to the parent and say, look what your child is doing right now. And then my documentation is done, because I'm able to report to them, look what your kid's doing, look how great this is. And because that's ultimately the most important person in that child's life, is the parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that has so much more meaning than just the, scheduled twice a year parent-teacher interviews, which are so much more formal.
It sure is. And this way I'm able to do it. It's spontaneously in the moment. It's to say, so this is the conversation that your child just had, and they're continuing. Look what they're doing now. They're playing cooperatively with this child, and they just figured out, and all of these kind of things. And it's amazing how often, I would say at least once a week, a parent is reduced to tears just because they're so joyful at recognizing what their children are demonstrating that they've learned.
Beautiful. So, Tom, what comes to mind when you hear the term school readiness?
I think it's the most ludicrous idea I've ever heard. I hear it everywhere I go, and I don't know what. It's not any child's job to be ready for school. It's always the school's job to be ready for the children. And when we talk about school readiness, 99% of the time, I think what people are talking about is, are they reading yet? At least coming out of preschool into kindergarten. And I actually hope they're not. I certainly hope they haven't been forced to learn. Because to me, because reading, for example, literacy, when you look at the data, Cambridge University, this was a few years back, basically one of their researchers went together and they tried to compile all the literature on literacy there was out there. And their bottom line recommendation was that formal literacy education should not begin before the age of 5 and really should start at about 7 years old, which is the model that, the famous Scandinavian schools use, where they don't really try to do that until about 7, because that's really when the brains, for the typical kid, that's when their brains begin to be ready for understanding literacy, and it's much easier for them to learn it then. The truth is the natural window for learning to read really is between about 5 years old and 11 years old, which shocks a lot of people, knowing that 11 is actually considered part of the normal range. And what the data shows is that when children are provided with formal literacy education before the age of 5 years old, they do get a small jump start on the rest of the kids. By the time the children are 8 years old, that lead has vanished. By the time the children are 15 years old, the children who did not receive the formal training are reading more for pleasure and with greater comprehension than the children who were forced to learn to read before they were ready. And so to me, that's usually what people are talking about when they say school readiness is literacy. But for me, basically, if you're able to get along with your friends and play in the context of a community, you'll be ready for pretty much anything that comes down the pike.
Yeah, music to my ears. And I'm so pleased you shared that about literacy, because I think that's something that really isn't well understood in the education community, but also in the parent community too. And there's a lot of parents who, they've got a child age 5.5 or 6, and they're being led to believe that their child is really behind. And it's just heartbreaking. They may be behind in the education system, but because the education system does not match a child developmentally.
Well, I think that it's actually a kind of cruelty that our policymakers have when they start insisting that children do things that they simply are not going to be developmentally ready for. In the States, we talk a lot about the fact that most people who are long-term kindergarten teachers say, well, we're now teaching a first grade curriculum in the kindergarten. What we used to be taught a year later is now being taught in kindergarten. And the preschools now are all teaching what used to be taught in kindergarten. We've just pushed it all down. And there is no evidence whatsoever that learning to read or do your mathematics earlier is better for you. There's no evidence at all to support that idea.
It's all about fear, isn't it? It's just this.
Totally about fear.
It's all about fear, and people don't want children to get behind, so let's just start it earlier. I call it academic creep. But you're right. Yeah. There's nothing to support that it's helpful, and in many cases, it is just so detrimental.
Well, and it's because it makes them anxious, it stresses them out, and it makes them dislike school, and it makes them believe that they're not capable learners. And children are natural learners. I mean, every time we watch them play, we all know, we've heard it, the stereotype, they're sponges, they soak everything up. But if suddenly we're telling them, well, you might be good at learning, but you got to learn this one thing that you're really not ready to learn, you're going to make them hate not only learning, school, and themselves, which is really the trifecta, right? It's the worst thing you could possibly do. But yes, it is fear-mongering. It is, to me, it's fear-mongering, and I really resent it. I do believe there are a lot of for-profit corporations out there who are trying to sell products And I'm not going to name any here on the thing, but you know who they are. They're big, giant education corporations who make standardized testing and textbooks and readiness materials and all this kind of stuff. And they need to sell it. Software. I mean, God, the technology guys are all over this. They're trying to make new software to make learning fun. You know, staring at a screen is not what learning looks like for young children.
Yep, spot on. Now, Tom, you have recently written a book called Teaching and Learning from Preschoolers. So I was going to ask you what the most powerful thing is that you've learned from the children you teach, but you already said to shut up. Is there another one that you could share with us?
I think the thing that I have really learned from children, and it's the opposite of what most, the stereotypes. We have a president right now where people keep accusing him of being childish. And I think that is such an insult to every child on earth. I think the kind of behaviors that adults engage in that tend to be selfish behaviors or self-centered behaviors and all that those are not childish behaviors. The children I work with, when allowed to make their own decisions, when given a framework of democracy in which to work together to make their own decisions, about what they want to learn, to ask and answer their own questions, to make their own decisions about who they're going to play with and how they're going to play during their day and how they're going to spend their time. What I find is children are naturally incredibly generous. They're incredibly giving. They're incredibly helpful with one another. And I believe that is the natural state of mankind. And I think that our culture tends to unteach that to us. I mean, the classic example for me, and this one hits close to home quite frequently for me. Our school is right in the heart of the city. And our city has a great deal of kind of visible street homelessness. And right above our school, there's a Baptist church where Pastor Gase kind of ministers to a lot of these guys. And we watch them, mostly it's men, and we watch them, passing overhead. And so the kids are very familiar that there are many of them are mentally ill, many of them are drug addicted, alcoholics, all of that type of thing. And they're coming to Pastor Gay for help of various kinds. But they've become part of our community too. And there was at one point, there was one of the guys, and he got mad about something, and at night he broke one of the windows, just an act of vandalism. The next day we got to school, and the kids, of course, saw this. And they said, well, we had a burglar. That was the word they kept. We had a burglar. So we talked about burglars, and we sat down together, and we said, well, what are we going to do? And I think we should trap the burglar. And they came up with all these traps and plans for capturing the burglar. And then at one point, one of the children kind of made some comment about, why would somebody want to be a burglar? And the other kid said, well, they don't have food. They don't have a home. They don't even have their own toilet. And then the conversation turned to immediately, even though they had felt violated, well, why don't we get them some food? Why don't we get them a job? I think we should just turn our playhouse into a home for them. And the kids themselves, that was their solution. And it was so beautiful to me that that's the one we rarely try as adult members of our society, is actually just giving the people what they need to get their lives back together. And so the children's generosity and their clear-sightedness, they tend to be incredibly generous. And I think it inspires me almost every single day.
I think, that's something we really need to strive to maintain in our little ones, because you're right. They're qualities that a lot of adults no longer have. But I agree, all the children I've worked with, it's just an intrinsic part of who they are.
Well, I say this all the time. There are only 3 categories of things adults know more than children about. Other than that, we're equals. The adults we know more about schedules, we know more about safety, and we know more about courtesy. Other than that, we're equals in terms of life or death issues and all the most important things in life. I think that we have as much to learn from them as they do from us.
Brilliant. Now, you are going to be hopping on a plane quite soon, actually, once this goes live, and you're coming to Australia where you're going to speak in various locations. Mm-hmm. Are you bringing your cape?
Oh, yeah. I would not travel without that cape. It's funny because I tried doing it one of the first times I traveled, and I was told very emphatically that I needed to show up with my cape from now on. That it's fascinating because that was probably the best $6 costume store purchase I ever made.
So more seriously though, if people want to find out about the locations and the topics that Tom is talking about, Inspired EC have got information up on their website. So I'll include a link in the show notes so that people can perhaps come and meet you in person.
I would love that. I love so much. This will be my 4th trip to Australia. And I just love being there. I love the people. I love the questions. I love the country. One of the reasons I like coming there in your wintertime is it feels like my summertime. And, but I really do have a good time, and I have so much fun meeting the people in Australia.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time, Teacher Tom. And I can't wait to meet you when you're in Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Claire. And I'm so happy I get to come to Adelaide. I had so much fun there last year when I was there, and I can't wait to return.
Brilliant. So that is the end of episode 66 of the Thriving Children podcast. Please come into the Facebook community to share your takeaways from this wonderful conversation. And until next time, be kind to yourself.
Thanks for listening to the Thriving Children podcast. For even more goodness, visit thrivingchildren.com.au.